So, Cale Makar did this less than a week ago. Let's talk about it and why he's so freaking good. At just 23 years of age, Cale Makar has a hockey resume that most players, even at the highest of levels, can only dream of. This includes individual accolades at nearly every single level of play, trailblazing a path to the NHL that is much less taken than usual, nearly single-handedly bringing a college program into national relevance, and potentially being the best player at his position in the entire world. But most importantly, he has the rosiest cheeks in the NHL. People bandy around the phrase generational talent far too often in relation to NHL players, but in the case of Cale Makar, he truly is one. Cale Makar's life started pretty standard for a Canadian pro hockey player. Born in Calgary, Alberta, he grew up with a full-size net in his living room, eating mayo chicken every single night, and imitating the hockey players of legend and lore in Canada like Bobby Orr, either in the basement or the backyard or out on the rink. Where Makar starts to diverge a little bit from other players was his father's interest in psychology, specifically related to sports psychology and the impact of positive thinking, instilling that mindset into Cale Makar at a young age, likely creating the smiling, happy player we see regularly today. Make no mistake though, under that extremely modest, happy guy is an extremely determined perfectionist when it comes to hockey. He said on record his favorite book is The Pursuit of Perfection. Makar always knew he wanted to be a hockey player, and as a kid was regularly playing in leagues with kids 3 years or more older than him. Playing on the defensive side, he was usually one of the top offensive producers for any team's defense throughout his youth career. But where the story really begins for Cale Makar is around the time he turned 16 and the major junior draft in Canada. Drafted in the 8th round in the WHL by the Medicine Hat Tigers, Makar opted to turn them down and instead go to the Junior A level with the Brooks Bandits of the AJHL. At the time, Makar was just 5'8" and significantly on the smaller side. He knew he would have to get bigger to really be considered an effective player. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but for now, let's just focus on his Junior A career. It took no time at all for Makar to adjust to that level. In his first full season with the Brooks Bandits, he was over a point-per-game player as a defenseman. In fact, he was the second highest producing defenseman in the entire league. His performance was good enough to get him his first look at international competition, going to the World Junior A Challenge for under 19 players. Team Canada West would end up placing 5th, so not a great showing there, but he would also get to play with a number of high-level players, including the tournament-leading scorer and teammate Tyson Jost. On top of that, he would also help the Bandits to the Junior A National Championship tournament, where they would ultimately lose in the semifinals, but Makar would win the award of MVP of the tournament. His play in this year, and maybe most importantly, his skating ability, had put him on the map for NHL teams coming into the year before his draft. For the entire year, he was usually ranked in the first round, but rarely inside the top 10. This was for two factors. One, he's playing in the AJHL, and two, his size. On the AJHL side of things, before Makar, there had only been 2 players from the AJHL picked in the first round, and on a bigger scale, from 2000 through 2016, there were less than 15 players picked in the first round from the entirety of Canadian Junior A, and most of those come from the BCHL and are forwards, such as the previously mentioned Tyson Jost. So despite Makar dominating that league, there were some questions around the quality of his competition. The other side of it was the size. Now, by the time the draft rolled around, Makar came in at 5'11", 187 pounds at the combine. Certainly significantly bigger than the 5'8" he was at 16 years old, but still, compared to the NHL, he was on the smaller side. Particularly just 5 years ago, where the NHL wasn't used to players being a little bit smaller, a lot like they are now. Players like Sam Girard, Alex DeBrincat, Cole Caulfields hadn't really come around on the super small side yet and proven that high-skill players without that size can function at the NHL level. Just for example, today, in the NHL, with all of those small players, the average size of an NHL defenseman is still 6'2", 210 pounds. So, Makar comes in significantly under that, and in a league still obsessed with big, heavy, strong defensive defensemen like teams were in the early 2010s, and yes, it's 2017, but a lot of teams still hadn't shaken out of that ideology yet. Makar was kind of battling against the current. With all that being said, Makar's play pretty much silenced anyone who was a doubter. As a defenseman, Makar would finish 6th in the AJHL in scoring with 75 points in 54 games, more than 20 points ahead of the next closest defenseman in the league. It would also lead him to his first international success, once again going back to the World Junior A Challenge, this time as captain of Team Canada West. They would manage to secure the gold, winning the whole tournament off of a lot of great work from Cale Makar. Back with Brooks, his incredible regular season performance would again bring Brooks to the National Junior A Championship for Canada, where Brooks would finish 2nd place, losing in the championship, but for the 2nd time, Cale Makar would win the MVP of the tournament. What had started the year as a first-round caliber defensive prospect had finished it with an extremely rapid ascent, especially as teams got to see more tape of Makar once the season was over, to seemingly a surefire top 10 lock. At the 2017 draft lottery, the Colorado Avalanche reached the lowest point in their franchise's history. After a 48-point season, finishing last in the league by a mile, they would also lose the draft lottery, falling down to the 4th overall pick. They would end up taking Cale Makar with that pick, and it may be the best thing to happen to the franchise. But Cale Makar's path to the NHL was nowhere near done at that point. He still had 2 years of college ahead of him. To get there, we have to go back to when Cale Makar was 16, first playing for the Bandits. While there, Makar was approached by UMASS, the only school at the time to approach and offer Makar the opportunity to play with them, and he would commit there in his first year with the Bandits. Obviously, this would end up being a steal for UMass, but it wasn't the most direct road to get to school for Cale. While he was playing with Brooks, UMass would undergo some massive changes. First of all, it seemed like an odd match to start with, as UMass had just 3 winning seasons since the 90s as a hockey program, and outside of one stint with Jonathan Quick in goal, really had not been any sort of interesting at the national level. 2, they would restructure their entire coaching staff shortly before Makar was set to join the program. Despite all this, Makar talked about remaining loyal to his decision and how loyalty had been something instilled in him from his parents since he was a child, and that he would be staying true to that. It also may have helped that UMass brought in a new head coach of Greg Carvel, who, by the way, just happened to also coach Erik Karlsson in the NHL, the guy that Cale Makar had been being compared to in his draft year. So despite it seeming like a weird fit, it ended up being a match made in heaven for both the player and the school. At the time, UMass had just one other NHL drafted player who decent in his own right on the defensive side, Mario Ferraro. But ultimately, this team was Cale Makar's to do whatever he wanted with and take as far as he possibly could. The school would end up going 9-13-2 in Makar's freshman year, which doesn't sound that great, but when you recognize they were coming off of back-to-back 2-win seasons, it was a significant improvement. It would also see UMass win their first conference tournament game in over a decade. Makar himself would put up a strong but not unbelievable performance with 21 points in 34 games, but more importantly, he would put his skills on display against full-grown men playing in the NCAA, and his skating in particular held up immaculately. But there was more to Makar's freshman year than just the NCAA. He also went to World Juniors that year. Now, Team Canada has always been a bit of an odd team, so I won't get too far into this, but to sum it up, Makar was invited as one of the World Junior defensemen, but was utilized as the 7th defenseman despite being a 4th overall pick. Didn't matter though. Despite being utilized as the 7th defenseman, Cale Makar was the only Canadian selected to the all-tournament team. Certainly offensively, there was little argument that Makar was not the best defenseman in the entire tournament, and helped be part of the team that won Canada Gold. There could have potentially been even more to this story on the international level, as Makar was invited to join the Canadian Olympic team as well in a year where professionals from the NHL were not going to the Olympics. They were taking amateurs such as players like Cale Makar and minor league hockey players too. While official reasons have never fully been disclosed, Cale Makar ultimately turned down Hockey Canada to go return to UMass and play with them. Given the way he was treated as a 7th defenseman at the World Juniors, can you really blame him? As a 4th overall pick, the Avs were happy enough with Makar's first year in college and were willing to offer him a contract to come play in the NHL. But Makar, again sticking to his loyalty, decided to remain at UMass for another year, not just because of that, but also because he believed that was the best path for his own development. And sitting here today, I think it's safe to say he made the correct decision on this one. So with all of that, Cale Makar came back for his second year at UMass with one goal in mind: cement a legacy, and that is absolutely what he did. With 49 points in 41 games, Cale Makar was not just the best player on the UMass team by far. He was 1 point shy of being the leading NCAA scorer as a defenseman. That's 1 point shy of forwards in that category. He had the intangibles as captain of UMass, and he had certainly the on-ice play that showed he was an absolute monster. Alongside fellow NCAA defenseman Adam Fox, who I'm sure we'll talk about more later, he was selected as one of the Hobey Baker finalists and would ultimately go on to win the award as a sophomore. Since its inception, he is the only sophomore defenseman to ever win the award. That would not be all, though. Cale Makar would lead UMass to the national championship game in the Frozen Four. And while ultimately the team would come up a little bit short, part of Makar's legacy is bringing UMass to relevance on the national stage. In fact, UMass continues to benefit as Makar has brought an abundance of talent to the program, and just this last year in 2021, UMass finally did the thing and won the national title. A lot of that is in thanks to Cale Makar putting them on the map. For Makar, though, there was no rest for the wicked. The minute that national title game was over, he was signing his contract with the Colorado Avalanche and heading to join the team in the middle of the first round of the playoff. Just 2 days after he lost a national title game, he was making his first ever NHL appearance. And, well, it was a hell of an appearance. In Calgary, his hometown, with his parents in attendance, in less than 17 minutes, Cale Makar was scoring his first ever NHL goal.
Kerfoot, now it's McKinnon. Racing through center ice, Makar trailing. He's got it. Makar is in, shoots, and he scores! Cale Makar, his first career National Hockey League goal!
The hype on this kid at that moment was already ridiculous, and after the goal went in, everybody completely lost their minds. The freight train was off the rails. Here's footage of me saying my thoughts on Cale Makar very early on in his NHL career.
it speaks for itself. The kid he's the best defenseman in Avalanche history. I'm just going to come out and say it.
Wow, okay.
He just is. It's a long way to go to reach the numbers that will equate to that, but talent-wise, he absolutely is.
I still believe that to be true right now as you're listening to this video, too. So, we've made it to Cale Makar at the NHL level, and somehow, all of that, it feels like his greatness is only beginning.
Yep.
After being a key contributor in the playoff run for the Avalanche, he would then start his first full true season the following year. Makar was a bolt of lightning to the Avalanche blue line from the beginning. In his first ever regular season game, he would play 22 minutes for Colorado, being a number one for them immediately. Makar would score 50 points in 57 games in his rookie season. For some context, that's 0.88 points per game. In the expansion era of the NHL, there are only 2 defensemen who have outproduced that in their rookie seasons on a per-game basis. Larry Murphy and Al MacInnis. Both of them are in the Hall of Fame, by the way. And it wasn't just that Makar was accruing points, he was doing highlight reel stuff on a near nightly basis from the back end. Makar would go on to win the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year over fellow defenseman Quinn Hughes. In his second season in the NHL, he would reach the point-per-game mark with 44 points in 44 games and would start to dominate the league on a more regular basis. Granted, there are some oddities across this time given the COVID pauses across both seasons, but it's still clear that Makar is, at least on the offensive side, no doubt one of the best players in the league. Makar would also make his first All-Star team in 2021. He would ultimately come second in the Norris vote to Adam Fox, which Adam Fox absolutely deserves the award. I'm not going to try to make that argument here, but what I will make is an argument for why Cale Makar could have and almost certainly will win one in the very near future. All of these statistics that we're about to take a look at are current as of January 1st, 2022. So depending on when you're watching this, the numbers may have changed a little bit, but the point they make still holds. Since Cale Makar entered the league, he is the most productive defenseman on a per-game basis in the NHL. This includes 3 Norris Trophy winners in the top 10, and for the most part is a list of who's who of the all-star defensemen in the league, especially as we get into some of these other statistics. Now, the reason we have to use per-game statistics or other rate stats that we'll get into is because one of Makar's weaknesses, and very likely the reason he lost the Norris, is availability. Across the course of his career, Makar has played in just over 80% of the possible games, regularly missing 13 to 15 games per season, even in the shortened seasons that he's played so far. Adam Fox, on the other hand, has missed 2 games in that entire time span. So, understanding that Makar may have a little bit of availability issues, he still puts up ridiculous rate stats. And yes, maybe you don't like point per game stats because per game means Makar plays a lot more minutes than a lot of other defensemen. So I want to take a deeper dive and look at his per 60 stats instead. The area where Cale Makar can't be denied by anyone, not even the biggest Adam Fox fan, is his goal scoring ability. Across the regular seasons of his career, Makar is the best shooting percentage defenseman by over 2%. And you'll see most of the names on this list, outside of John Carlson, are completely different than the points per game leaders list too. Oftentimes, goal scorers do fall a little bit into that Cy Young category on the offensive side, but that's absolutely not the case with Cale Makar. I don't believe this statistic to be a fluke either, because Makar stands right in the middle of total shots on goal for this shooting percentage, outshooting some of the lower-end guys on this list. Yes, he's not up into the ridiculous numbers of shots on goal like a Zach Werenski, but he shoots plenty, and he makes it count often. And what makes this stat even more impressive is the fact that this isn't just a rate stat for Cale Makar. When you look at all defensemen across this time, Makar is the leading goal scorer as a counting stat as well, even when you consider that in some cases he's played 30 games or more less than some of these guys. When we flip over to the assist side of things, you start to see the only player in Makar's atmosphere when it comes to offensive production rates is John Carlson. But you see once again, this time John Carlson outpacing him just a little bit, but Makar top 2. Interestingly, despite John Carlson's blossoming offensive numbers, he hasn't won a Norris yet, but that's a story for another day. Maybe the most interesting stat here, though, is Cale Makar's Corsi 4%. This looks at a metric of relatively how often his team possesses the puck when he's out there. This is where you see players like John Carlson and Tyson Barries of the world fall off significantly. Makar, once again, is the second best player in this statistic since he joined the league. By the way, hi Devontae, how you doing? And while Makar does get his fair share of offensive zone starts, he does start in the D zone plenty. I think nationwide or worldwide, however you want to call it, Makar's defensive side of the game is actually a bit underrated. He's never been afraid to throw big hits and do what he has to do, making quality plays away from the puck, and once he gets the puck is always going the right direction. This pattern holds throughout nearly every advanced statistic that you can find on a rate basis for Makar, ranking usually in the top 2 and at worst in the top 5 in most cases. Certainly in the era of advanced statistics, Makar is putting up the best numbers we have ever seen. All of this, and I really haven't talked about his skating that much. I've mentioned it once or twice, but it's what really does make Makar a special hockey player. He's capable of doing things on blue lines, walking into the offensive zone, or even going coast to coast that most players just aren't. Skating is an ability that, at least personally, I'm not entirely sure how to describe it when it's on a level of Cale Makar's. So if you haven't noticed in the highlights I've shown so far, watch these couple of ones and just be amazed for a second. While you're enjoying Makar's skating, there are 2 weaknesses in his game, in my opinion. I've already talked about one, his availability. He does have to start staying a little bit more healthy as his career goes forward if he really wants to cement himself as one of the best defensemen ever, which is something I do believe he's capable of. But 2, and this is the one the Adam Fox crowd will use and is justifiable to a certain extent, Cale Makar doesn't really penalty kill at all. If you're looking for a true all-around defenseman, it's probably something you want them to do a little bit more of. Now, to be fair, I don't think Cale Makar doesn't penalty kill because he can't. We saw him do it in the NCAA with UMASS. They had no problem rolling him out there, and he was just fine. The Avs are just such a good hockey team that they don't need Cale Makar to penalty kill. If he was on a weaker team with a weaker defense, there's a very good chance he would be doing some PKing. But in the world we live in, that's just not his role, and that is a hole in his game at the NHL level. All in all, Cale Makar embodies everything that a modern NHL defenseman wants to be. And the fact that he's done it at just 23 years of age means he has a whole lot more of this to go ahead of him. And it's going to be an absolute blast watching this kid reach his peak and be maybe not just the best defenseman in the world, but possibly top 5, top 3, maybe best player regardless of position in the entire world. This was a different style of video that I've really been wanting to do for a long time. And please let me know down in the comments if you guys like stuff like this, if you want to see more stuff like this. I had a blast creating this video on Makar, so I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. If you do really like content like this, be sure to like and subscribe here on the YouTube channel, and go check us out at DNVR.com, where we do have all sorts of other pieces on Avs players and things like this in written format. We do podcasts, of course the YouTube videos as well. I am Rudo, and enjoy every second you get of Cale Makar, because players this good just don't exist very often.